It's 1 o'clock. I think we're ready to start. Thank you.
So welcome to this event hosted by the Information Integrity Lab, part of the University of Ottawa Professional Development Institute, organized in collaboration with the International Commission of Jurists. Bonjour à tous et toutes, nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir. Mon nom est Serge Blais, je suis le directeur général de l'Institut de développement professionnel. My name is Serge Blais, I'm the executive director of the University of Ottawa Professional Development Institute. I also send greetings from our president, Mr. Jacques Frémont, who could not be in attendance today, being out of town, but he sends his warm regards as well. La session d'aujourd'hui se déroulera essentiellement en anglais, mais libre à vous de poser vos questions ou faire vos interventions en français. Au besoin, nous ferons l'interprétation. We have a great audience today with participants from across Canada and the United States, with representatives from government, industry, academia, and civil society. Special greetings, if I may, to Yassir Naqvi, Member of Parliament for Ottawa Centre. Also representatives from several federal government departments, from law firms, from public safety agencies, private sector organizations, the general public as well, among others. So welcome all. A word, if I may, on what is the Information Integrity Lab before I pass it over to our chair. The lab has been created as a network of organizations and subject matter experts from various fields, including, for example, law, engineering and computer science, data analytics, of course, policy making, media, communications, and many others, all with an interest in not only better understanding disinformation, but finding and proposing solutions to deal with this growing peril, because disinformation is a peril. The impact of disinformation on public trust, on democratic government, on truth-based decision-making, on industry and enterprise, on private citizens cannot be underestimated. Studying and countering disinformation is a huge and complex task, and it has to be done in the context of freedom of expression guarantees and of privacy laws. And it cannot be perceived as an exercise to blunt legal and legitimate dissent. But this being said, let's agree that not much good ever comes from ill-intended disinformation. A colleague of mine this morning was referring to disinformation as the accelerant for division and extremism. I think that sums it up nicely. This session, I'm sure, will provide insights and perhaps also challenge our thinking. And so I'm happy to now introduce the chair of this conference, Professor Errol Mendez. Professor Mendez of the University of Ottawa is a recognized legal scholar who has taught, researched, consulted, and published extensively in the areas of global governance, international business law and ethics, constitutional law, international human rights, corporate law, among others. He has authored and co-edited 11 books, is the editor-in-chief of the National Journal of Constitutional Law. He has been senior advisor in the Privy Council office and a visiting professional at the Criminal Court in The Hague, as well as visiting professor at the Harvard Law School and at Oxford University. Professor Mendez was awarded the Order of Ontario, the Law Society Medal, and inducted in the Royal Society of Canada. So I think you'll agree with me that the conference is in good hands. I'll pass it over to you, Errol, for the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. Before I begin and introduce the panelists one by one, I'd like to start by setting out the seriousness of what we are discussing today by giving you the results of a recent poll that was recently conducted in May 20th to 24th by Abacus Poll. And these are some of the results that they focused on in terms of what Canadians believe or disbelieve in. And the stats are quite shocking. They found that 44% believe that big events like wars, recessions, and the outcome of elections are controlled by small groups of people working in secret against us. Almost as many agree that much of our lives are being controlled by plots hatched in secret places. Another 37% think there is a group of people in this country who are trying to replace native-born Canadians with immigrants who agree with their political views. This is an articulation of what was commonly referred to as the so-called replacement theory by white nationalists, supremacists. Another 20% believe it is definitely or possibly true that the World Economic Forum is a group of global elites with a secretive strategy to impose their ideas on the world. And then shockingly, 13% think it's definitely or possibly true that Microsoft founder Bill Gates is using microchips to track people and affect human behavior through the COVID vaccines. Another 21% said it could be possibly true. Now, what these stats show is that perhaps the most disconcerting thing in these numbers is the fact that mistrust of institutional accounts in the most important areas of our society is simply accompanied by a willingness to believe dangerous contrarian theories. This threatens to undermine the ability of political parties, businesses, civil society groups, and governments to help construct consensus and make progress together as a society. I would add that it also impacts on what is known as the rule of law. So with that, I would like to start introducing each of the panelists, starting with Kevin Sheeves as the first panelist. Kevin is the director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, the research and the analytical section of the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States. He has led the forum's research and convening in areas such as the integrity of the information space, authoritarian influence and sharp power, transnational kleptocracy, and emerging technologies' impacts on democracy. Kevin joined the forum in August of 2020. For nearly 15 years, he served as manager and advisor at State Department officials, leading U.S. diplomatic and governmental responses to strategic competition with China on issues of global disinformation and the Asia-Pacific's rise. He also served in roles in the Defense Department, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and in Congress. Kevin, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Errol. Really appreciate it. And it's really exciting to be a part of this initiative with the Information Integrity Lab at the University of Ottawa. As I'll get to it later, these sort of initiatives can be really valuable in combating the spread of disinformation really all around the world. And the word information integrity of Information Integrity Lab really is aptly named. A lot of people will use disinformation as shorthand for many forms of information manipulation, whether they're disinformation or lies, or misinformation, which is unintended spread of lies, propaganda or tools of the state to deceive and distract those that they target, malinformation, which is information taken out of context. All of these types of things, and honestly many more, are all things that sort of muddy the information space for your average information consumer. I think it's important at the outset to understand that these problems are also not just online problems. They're also offline problems in communities of worship, traditional TV and media, and even the family dinner table. Disinformation also, which I'll use as shorthand from here on out, is also a global problem. Canada, United States, and other Western democracies aren't the only ones suffering from this information disorder. Elsewhere, you have political violence, polarization, and a dystopian information space. In places like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Ethiopia, Colombia, all of these have evidence that have ultimately led to offline violence with really awful effects for the future of people's everyday security and, of course, democracy itself. Some of the roots for modern day polarization and this information disorder can be traced globally, I think, to authoritarian propaganda and influence operations, the playbooks of populists, and, of course, activity on global social media platforms, who I appreciate they're joining later today. However, local and national politicians are also adapting these authoritarian tools for their own purposes. The tools for doing so now extend well beyond Russia's Internet Research Agency and other well-known government-affiliated operations. They include disinformation hiding operations and a wide variety of tools for troll operations, automated amplification of government propaganda, and the surveillance of opposition targets. Sometimes these tools are simply found in sort of modern public relations firms that, if we said the names, you might even know them. Like disinformation, counter-disinformation activities are also proliferating. There are initiatives sprouting up daily to counteract these threats to the information space, such as, let me just name a few. So a research field right now that I think is very dynamic and very skilled, You have names like the Digital Forensic Research Labs or DFR Lab, Graphica, and I'm sure University of Ottawa's Information Integrity Lab will be part of that group as well. Second, nearly every field of development and public service is concerned with disinformation. In the climate sphere, in the health sphere, in the youth empowerment sphere, and of course, for many in the government sphere, both national security and law enforcement and foreign affairs agencies, all have some aspects of their funding or operations or analytical capabilities focus on this concept of disinformation. Organizations around the world, small and big, are rising up to counter this challenge. There's a number of different research articles out there that have done this work. We've done some ourselves, but they've counted upwards of 200 to 300 or more organizations globally that do some of the traditional counter disinformation work, like fact checking or media literacy programs. The best tools for countering disinformation, I found at least, are really not in government, and they're not even in the platforms, but in fact, really, they're in civil society. All three of these sectors, government, private industry, and civil society, they must work together. But I think civil society has the innovation, it has the credibility, it has the adaptability that some of these other sectors don't have, but not yet, hopefully, enough of the power or resources to really combat disinformation at scale. Let me walk through this argument a little bit more. So government regulation of speech, as we referenced a little bit earlier in the introduction, is fraught with peril. Many regimes that are trending more authoritarian, they've leveraged things like fake news laws and other tools that simply are meant to monitor and punish opposition viewpoints and not really deal with this problem of disinformation. Government, I think, has many roles in monitoring, responding to national security threats, funding civil society organizations like the US and others do, and protecting its own legitimate activities from information manipulation. But I don't think it's really the only answer to this problem. Second, platforms oftentimes have the most resources and sometimes the most power here when you account for the data, the ability to control and influence speech on their own platforms. And increasingly, they're huge, as in the tens of thousands of people strong content moderation operations, which measure really an extraordinarily amount of work being done, not just in sort of the West and English-speaking societies, but elsewhere as well. However, unfortunately, the motives for these companies for growth, profit, and service to the views of its individual leaders sometimes make sustained commitments to free speech grounded in reality and free from interference by attempts to manipulate public trust. That really doesn't excuse the platforms for action, I think, in this area, but instead it really should motivate them to enshrine democratic principles at the outset of these technologies that are organizing our information discourse, and elevate researchers and activists to a position where they're not just the eyes and ears of global content moderations around the world, but really also a part of the decision-making loop. That's a real fundamental rethink of the relationship between platforms and civil society. As you think about these sort of work in Canada, I think there are typically tools that are found in places like Canada. They're actually quite fit for the challenge, where I think many societies around the world have failed or maybe are in worse shape. Societies that have done better than others on average in dealing with seemingly intractable challenges like this, they've had a few characteristics. First off, a vibrant civil society, even if one that's not fully yet aimed at the disinformation challenge. I'll give you one example that everyone knows about now, Ukraine. Ukraine has transformed its ability to turn its vibrant civil society into measured success against Russian influence operations in the information space. And really, that's a capacity that has really accelerated and been built up since its opening in 2014. And ultimately, obviously, had an incredible security effect on its own national security, which obviously is still being threatened daily by Russia. Second, societies have had longer histories of democratization. One frustrating case here that has not had as long of a history of democratization is the stalled democratization of what's happened in the Philippines, where its last two presidential campaigns have been fraught with successful attempts, unfortunately, by authoritarian-leaning populist leaders like Duterte and now Marcos Jr. to spread disinformation at scale using really for-hire social media firms. These leaders preyed upon an information space that was really hardly established, protected, and respected under more democratic administrations successively before it, as they attempted to transition from authoritarian impulses back 35 years ago, including from the new president of Philippines' father. Third, political systems that are successful are ones that are able to forge compromises and hold the center. Parliamentary coalition favoring systems, somewhat like Canada's, with strong traditions, have held up better than some. Germany and France have both seen the rise of populist nationalist movements that have fed upon the grievances and tactics of populist parties elsewhere. But they've been more successful, I think, to be able to legislate, adapt, and manage some of these political differences in a highly pluralistic, ethnically diverse societies that are undergoing constant economic and social strains. Parliamentary coalition favoring systems, with some exceptions, of course, have proven a little bit more pliable than others, such as the United States, unfortunately, and presidential systems in Latin America and elsewhere. Fourth, societies that tend to succeed have a strong technical and educational capacity among its average citizens. Central Europe and the Baltic states have produced really an incredible amount of innovative, effective solutions at scale. One incredibly innovative approach is the growth of decentralized, citizen-led counter-disinformation responders called ELVs, who log in online daily to track and call out oftentimes Russian propaganda. These technical skills that your average Baltic or Central European individual or professional have, and a strong history of citizen activism, have really allowed these informal networks to flourish and produce counter-disinformation and fact-checking at scale. Another thought to keep in mind is that I think operating through a networked approach is really essential for any counter-disinformation responder or researcher. As an organization that sits at the intersection of research and grant making in the global democracy space, International Forum, we found that some of the most successful organizations are first interdisciplinary. They include thought leaders and staff from many disciplines beyond the communications and political sciences. Citizen Lab at University of Toronto is one excellent example, and I'm really happy to see University of Ottawa take that on with its Information Integrity Lab and understanding its mission as well. Two, learning from others well outside their local information environment. These problems are global. They're not just limited to Canada's information space. There's a good chance others in the field have seen the problem that Canada's facing. Igor Blazevich, who's a real trailblazer in defending human rights and democracy, is European. He challenged civil society activists all around the world to spend 1/4 of their time thinking beyond their immediate local crisis and instead learn from others outside of their local environment. That's an extraordinary ask from an individual who's heavily invested in addressing human rights and democracy crises in hard, intense places, whether they're in Burma, you name it. Lastly, sharing with others is extremely important. Data in this space should be open and accessible. That's table stakes, really, for any sort of organization doing research in this area. And honestly, that goes to the platforms, I think, first and foremost, of keeping their data open and accessible. Countering disinformation at scale doesn't mean one organization does all the work. You share together, you learn together, you adapt together. That's really the future, I think, of counter-disinformation work globally. So thanks, and I look forward to hearing about everyone else's thoughts as well.
Thank you, Kevin. That was fantastic. You've given us a lot of ideas, and I'm really interested in learning more about the so-called ELVs that you mentioned. Maybe it's something that Canada can look into and seeing if we can create Canadian ELVs. But with that in mind, I'd like to now introduce the next speaker. Yves Gramont is the director of the Innovative Ideas Incubator Program in the International Observatory on the societal impacts of AI, artificial intelligence, and digital technology at the Faculty of Law, University of Laval, Quebec. Her graduate and research work at Laval University focused on the risks and the benefits of using AI to enhance the intelligibility of judicial information. She has published extensively on data privacy, online speech, AI regulation, privacy in the digital age, and machine learning. You can also read some of her work at an internationally recognized US-based legal blog called Lawfare, where she is a contributor, including an extensively read and discussed article titled, "Is Canadian Law Better Equipped to Handle Disinformation?" Yves, you have the floor. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It was super interesting to hear what Kevin had to say. Personally, as a French Canadian, who has been writing, as you said, about this information for Americans and English-speaking Canadians, there's something I always find pretty jarring with respect to digital policy in Canada. It's nothing completely new. It's a well-known phenomenon for a long time, actually. And yes, I'm talking about the infamous two solitudes. That is to say, the fact that sometimes Quebec and the rest of Canada seems to be talking past each other. That there seems to be a lack of communication between those two nations. And given that the ministers in charge of regulating digital platforms are often Quebecers, I thought that it would be an interesting topic to touch on today, given that the audience is, I presume, mostly from the United States and English-speaking regions of Canada. Indeed, I truly believe that if Canada wants to learn from other nation mistakes and be a leader in the way it tackles the disinformation problem, as it is suggested in the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression report, well, if we want to do that, all Canadians have to work together. So I've decided that I would outline the main differences and the main differences in the way we perceive the problem and the main differences in the way we want to tackle the issue. So I found that the difference between Quebec and Canada is, of course, especially striking when it comes to cultural content. If we think about a few years ago, the deal that Mélanie Joly has striken with Netflix, it was received really differently in Quebec than in the rest of Canada. Of course, recently the reception of Bill C-11 is quite different in Quebec than in other provinces. Quebec sees it quite positively, while it's received with more controversies in the rest of Canada. And that's the main reason why this perception is different. It's because we Quebecers feel like we have to protect our culture, of course, our music, our TV shows, and the platforms like Netflix or YouTube, they seem to be posing a threat to these. Now, what do TV shows and singer-songwriters have to do with democracy, you may ask? Well, since Quebecers feel threatened by the platforms for cultural reasons, they are also more prone to see the platforms as the main cause of the disinformation crisis. Actually, the expression digital barbarians, coined by Radio Canada's, so CBC former Director of Information, Alain Saunier, is a term that is growing and getting quite a bit of traction. And we are seeing it quite often in the medias, the public discourse, and it's likely to influence the politicians and hence the debates regarding the regulation of disinformation. Another thing that is quite striking is that we often hear in Quebec people describing Cambridge Analytica as the main reason why Donald Trump was elected in the United States, even though we know very well now that the actual impact was quite limited. And it is, yes, lay people, of course, but journalists and scholars also are using this example a lot. So as a result of that, generally speaking, Quebecers are much more comfortable with the idea of platforms and regulation than the English-speaking Canadians. Though everybody understands that we're in a nation that really cares about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and there's not a lot of interest in deciding what should be said or should not be said. We've moved away from that, from the idea that we should work a lot on content moderation and use censorship regulation. We have reached a point where we are talking about more meta, more regulation that focus on the system instead of the particular content. So, for instance, Quebecers are on board with transparency requirements to have a better understanding of how algorithm works, how the advertisement, for instance, in the context of election would be interesting to know more how the advertisement is done. There's also an interest, maybe more than in the rest of Canada, about reenacting Section 91.1 of the Election Act that prevents sharing certain kind of false information in the context of an election, which was quashed last year. I think this provision was quashed because it was found unconstitutional, because it was going against Section 2B of the Charter. And there's also an appetite in Quebec for rethinking the rules of intermediary liability, what's commonly known in the US as Section 230, and in Quebec as Section 22 of the Act, to establish a legal framework for information technology. But though there might be more interest in Quebec than in the rest of Canada to regulate tech platforms, of course, Quebecers are well aware that the problem is definitely not only a tech problem, that it also has a lot to do with the whole information ecosystem. So the main discussion at the moment, which is once again driven by Alain Saunier, former director of Radio-Canada, really regards the information ecosystem and the ownership of medias, thinking about competition laws, for instance, to build a more resilient information ecosystem, a more diverse information ecosystem, so as to make sure that these medias are trustworthy, and which is important for fighting disinformation. We know that when the population has a trust in the medias, it's easier to, it's an important component of tackling the disinformation crisis. There's also discussion about the funding of medias. So the consensus, I wouldn't say consensus, but there's a general agreement that Google and Facebook are infringing on copyright laws when they are using the content from other sharing the content of medias on their platforms. So scholars in Quebec really want them to pay the medias and to strike deal with the medias to fund journalism in Quebec and Canada. There are also lots of interest about tax reforms, and once again, to gather money to fund the medias. So yeah, basically that's a short overview of what the conversation looked like in Quebec, and where the main differences are. But the point that I really wanted to drive home with this presentation is that the distinction, the differences between Quebec and Canada really all come from the fact that Quebecers feel threatened by the platforms way more than Canadian, because of the old cultural thing that I was discussing earlier. So instead of fighting, I think, on the policy proposal, where I really think that the discussion should happen. The conversation should really be about what was being clear on what's the problem, having a good diagnosis of the problem. And this way, I think that if we're having the conversation about the problem instead of the solutions, we might come to an agreement more easily. So yes, I don't know how I did with the time, but I'll let Chris follow me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Yves. It is really important to get your perspective from Quebec, because oftentimes we often think that we speak with one voice and one approach to this very troublesome area. And it's really important that you mentioned. I think what you mentioned in terms of the need for a more systems approach may be coming not only from Quebec, but as we will discuss, hopefully by others in the panel, that may also be coming from Europe in terms of the same area of attacking disinformation. With that in mind, I'd like now to introduce the next panelist, Chris Tennov, who is a research associate and instructor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia. He has just published a report, actually, just yesterday, which he co-authored with Heidi Turek, called Online Hate in the Pandemic. It was commissioned by the BC Office of the Human Rights Commissioner as a part of the inquiry into hate in the pandemic area. It'd be interesting to hear some of his conclusions. He was previously at the University of Toronto's Centre for Ethics and the Munk School for Global Affairs. He conducts research in the fields of political theory, political communication, and international relations. He has published peer-reviewed articles, books, book chapters, and policy reports on cybersecurity threats, harmful speech, and disinformation. In 2020, he won a CRTC Prize for Excellence in Policy Research for an article titled Protecting Democracy from Disinformation, Normative Threats and Policy Responses, which was published in the International Journal of the Press and Politics. That article is still actually featured quite prominently on the website of the CRTC today. Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. As Eve ended by saying that focusing on problems might help us come to some greater agreement. And what I want to do for most of my initial talk here is to talk about some of the problems. As Errol just mentioned, I've been doing research on disinformation and on the abuse of public figures, particularly in Canada, though also some work beyond Canada, looking at public figures, including politicians and journalists, and then most recently work on health communicators. So I'm going to focus on some of this ongoing research on health communicators that I'm doing. And I should say, because of the type of work I've been doing, which involves looking at just thousands and thousands of mean messages sent to people and then doing interviews with the targets of those messages, I can have, sometimes a jaundiced view about how people use social media. But I want to start with something more positive. If we cast our mind back 2 years to the early days of the pandemic, public health officials had this extraordinary challenge, which was how do you get people to change behavior quickly and dramatically and at a mass scale, and not through putting men with guns on street corners to force people to stay home, but significantly through persuasion and through messaging. And so we saw some pretty extraordinary efforts by public officials and journalists to get the information out and to try and encourage safer behavior. But I found particularly interesting some of the efforts by physicians and nurses and university-based researchers and other experts to kind of, in different ways, step up and fill gaps in public messaging and public understanding. And so that includes a virologist at UBC learning how to leverage TikTok to get information about vaccines and viruses to younger audiences. It includes a task force, a kind of informal group of medical professionals who realized real shortcomings in communication to the South Asian communities, and so developed their network, put together content in multiple languages, used Instagram and Twitter, and got into WhatsApp networks to deal with rumors there to try and, again, inform people about this rapidly changing health predicament. And so it was this pretty tremendously dynamic explosion of public interest communication made possible by the social media platforms in part, along with other other channels. So that's a positive side. the health communicators kind of leaping into these spaces may not have realized what they'd be facing in the months that come, and that would involve messages, and here's our few that we found, like being told that for what they're doing they should rot in hell, that they are guilty of crimes against humanity and will face a new version of Nuremberg trials, that they would be asked, how many more children are you going to kill, or are you going to be responsible? How many more children are you going to be responsible for letting die? And these sorts of things. And so, I've interviewed a few dozen health communicators about these experiences, and that, and looking at some of the social media traffic they face. I just want to set out sort of 4 different categories of problematic material. And so the first one are the explicit threats, the explicit racism or misogyny. This is material that violates the terms of standards of some of the major platforms, terms of services, and in some cases could violate Canadian laws. There's not a lot of this material, and not a lot of it sticks around. The good news is, the platforms, with the assistance of flagging by users, are able to catch a fair amount of it. And there isn't maybe a lot to begin with. So there's kind of especially as a researcher, a needle in the haystack problem of locating this material that's still live. But we do find it occasionally, and we do have our interviewees showing it to us. So it happens. People get this kind of material, and though rare, it has a significant impact on them, and there are real struggles to get action on it. Sometimes people feel like they don't get action from the platforms on material that they think clearly violates terms of service. Maybe we can have a debate about that, but they wish there were other ways to leverage to get platform action. Or have it reviewed, but also real challenges with getting what they think is appropriate action from police or security, other types of security resources. Because this most intense abusive material often has an offline component of offline risks and threats too. So that's one category. A second one is material that isn't illegal, may not violate terms of service. It's what we sometimes refer to as the lawful but awful content. Now, this might contribute to some of the same harms as the explicit material. And so, while say messages saying a health communicator should be hung might be removed, we would still see messages accusing them of crimes against humanity, or or broadly accusing them of being responsible in various ways for the deaths of people because of the public health regulations that they've been promoting. So the narratives continue even if the most explicit problematic material gets taken down, and that's something that is a challenge to address. This kind of messaging has a real sort of psychological toll on health communicators, contributes to a sense of insecurity, and some do choose to withdraw, feel that there's too much at stake, at risk for engaging in public communication on these issues. And some research by our team and other groups has found that this consequence of being pushed out of public communication seems to be have a greater impact or be more likely for women and for racialized individuals. So third is the volume problem. A number of health communicators talked to me about the experience of what seemed to be facing the same messages from the same sources day in and day out. That rather there being anything like a functioning marketplace of ideas where a better messages were winning out, it was more like a war of attrition. People just grinding out the same messages over and over again. And one issue here with this sort of incivility or misinformation at scale is both the kind of wear and tear it has on the people who are dealing with it, but also that the time that they are engaging or responding with that is time that could be spent doing more productive things. And then the last issue I want to mention that came up with health communicators was their concerns about the way that the online spaces where they were having public discussions or trying to engage the publics were being deformed by these online spaces and their design or how they operate. And one of the issue was, we've heard it many times before, but this sense that the more extreme or sensational content tends to rise. And so, and just to be clear, this is in kind of pandemic-related communication. This is coming from different sides of the debate. So the accusation of someone being responsible for letting children die came from an account that consistently is asking for stronger regulations to address the pandemic. And so health communicators felt like they were often seeing the more extreme and in some ways often less helpful contributions to debates being the ones that really jumped out and were getting attention on the platforms. And some also spoke about feelings of their own style of communication being somewhat deformed by what they were doing to be successful on platforms. And so maybe it's themselves using more provocative or sensational material or atting, Joe Rogan or some other public figure because you want to get into that space, you want to be seen. But to do that, sometimes you're having to engage in a style of communication that isn't as ideal for generating productive and inclusive communication. So there's and they talked about the real tensions there of wanting to be part of the debate, to be heard, to get their voices out there, but concerns about what they had to do to achieve that. So those are some of the challenges that health communicators can face. And I just want to take this back to where a lot of this conversation today is going, which is the policymaking implications. I think just speaking in broad terms, we can see that that these are quite different problems and that different types of solutions, complementary responses are needed. And so yes, there's the types of responses that are looking at these extremely problematic pieces of content that may need to be addressed with quick takedowns of content, which may need to find forms of individual accountability, whether the legal system or criminal system or others. Those need to be there and made more effective. And then kind of on the spectrum, there's all the mechanisms that are needed to improve the consistency and effectiveness of content moderation policy by the platforms. And this could include things, and maybe Vivek will talk about it, around human rights audits of algorithms and used or the patterns of discourse that platforms are supporting. But then at the other end are the policies needed to incentivize the development of maybe new and better spaces for these kind of communications. Those could include ones that government agencies can deploy to get public input, to do public engagement. So they're not having to rely on these other platforms for that kind of stuff. It certainly includes the kind of empowering of civil society that Kevin was talking about at the beginning. So those are just kind of, I think, a sense of that spectrum of policymaking responses. And just the last two things, very quickly. I mean, one, we're talking about Twitter and Facebook, and we have their, representatives showing up later. These aren't the only platforms. Others are doing a lot less. And so it's worth thinking about that broader array of intermediaries, including in Canada, that we need to look at. And that also this really is not, as Kevin said, just a social media or internet issue. And political elites are major drivers of disinformation and incivility. And it does seem to be an issue there getting worse. And so maybe that's another thing we can talk about, which goes a little bit beyond the infrastructure, the online infrastructure for these problems, but some of the actors who are driving it. So I'll let Vivek take us home with the solutions to these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris. As you said, there is no silver bullet. We may be trying to find many, many solutions to this very difficult problem. So with that, I'd like to introduce now Vivek Murthy, my friend and colleague at the Faculty of Law. Vivek is a Samuelson Gluckso Professor of Law and Director of the Samuelson Gluckso Canadian International Policy and Public Interest Clinic at the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. Vivek's teaching, scholarship, and clinical legal practice focuses on the complex regulatory and human rights related challenges that arise in cyberspace. He has advised governments, activists, and companies on the human rights impacts of new technologies and is a frequent public commentator on emerging technologies and public policy issues. Along with his former colleagues at Harvard Law School's Berkman Klein Center, Vivek is the author of a landmark study for Global Affairs Canada that evaluates the risks and opportunities for human rights that artificially intelligent systems present. Vivek was previously the Assistant Director of Harvard Law School's Cyber Law Clinic and counsel in the Corporate Social Responsibility practice at Foley Hogg LLP. He is a Rhodes Scholar and clerked for the Maurice Fish of the Supreme Court of Canada upon his graduation from law school at Yale. He was also a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School, an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a senior associate of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. And on a personal note, I am so glad we got him back from the U.S. Thank you. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you, Errol, for that very kind introduction, and it's truly a pleasure to be here. It is both a pleasure, but perhaps a bit of a task as well to come at the end of three great speakers who have covered so much ground. And I think I've shown us how, multidimensional, multifaceted, and multinational the problem of disinformation is. So I'm going to try to answer the question that Tina Turner almost asked in a song. What's law got to do with it? What can we do in terms of legal responses to disinformation? We've heard really from all three of the speakers who came before me that we need this multi-pronged approach, that civil society needs to take the lead, that there needs to be more resilience, all this great stuff. But can't we just pass a law? That's usually the kind of response many people have, certainly when I talk to lay people. So let's unpack that a little bit. One of the things about disinformation that's really hard is that it poses a fundamental challenge to the law and the theory of free expression. So let's start, from the beginning. Why is there a right to free speech or free expression in international human rights law, the Canadian Charter, and the constitutions of most countries? Well, it's because of a belief in something called the marketplace of ideas, right? There's this notion that if you let people speak freely and express themselves, bad ideas are going to lose because the truth is going to win eventually. But as we know from markets for conventional goods, there can be market failures in marketplaces, right? Unsafe products get sold. People don't pay the price of pollution when they pollute. And we're kind of seeing a bit of that in the marketplace of ideas. And I think the previous speakers pointed to why, which is that some powerful people have incentives to engage in informational pollution, right? Politicians spreading disinformation for political reasons. Those trying to make a quick buck by trying to get people to click on ads, etc. And also, speed is an accelerant. And we've seen this in conventional markets. Some of you might remember the flash crash on Wall Street caused by high frequency trading computers, right? Similarly, the speed at which information flows online can make it really hard for reasoned debate to happen, etc. So the law of free expression is built on this theory that the marketplace of ideas should work, and we have a problem with that. So there's a bit of a gap. And the law of free expression, it's a really important area of law, but it's very underdeveloped compared to many other fields of regulation. We have just couple of dozen Supreme Court of Canada cases that deal with the right to free expression. Even the United States, right? The Constitution's been around for 230 years. They have about 200 Supreme Court cases that deal with their First Amendment. Okay, so first point, right? We have a fundamental challenge. So there's a bad fit between the law of free expression and the theory and the problem of disinformation. That's not to say that there's nothing we can do about it. Freedom of expression here in Canada and at the international level is subject to what's called reasonable limitation, right? You can't just say anything. The archetypal example of, shouting fire in a crowded theater is certainly actionable. So too is fraud. And if we think about commercial fraud, it's a kind of form of disinformation, right? Where someone is intentionally telling you something false and causes you economic harm in this case. But the question is really around the details and the scalability of how we would actually legislate. For one point, if we're going to tackle the problem head on, we're going to have laws that try to adjudicate the truth or the falsity of what people say and try to discern the intent that they, as to why they're expressing it. As Kevin pointed out in his remarks, that's a really dangerous path, right? It's one that many authoritarians have gone down in passing sort of fake news laws to criminalize people who actually want to tell the truth. So that's not a really great option to go after it directly. Nor is, even if we could solve those kinds of issues, it just isn't scalable. If we had courts sitting there trying to adjudicate whether or not this piece of information is false or not, if you were saying it with a bad intent or not, we'll never get anywhere, right? The problem is just out of scale to that kind of solution. Now, of course, there's more to the law than just criminal law, right? For example, if I say something unpleasant about some of my colleagues on this panel that injures their reputation, they can sue me. Civil remedies are available, but those two suffer from the same kinds of scalability problems, and they're costly to administer. But there's also another difficult issue, which is that in the law of free expression, as in the law of constitutional and human rights more generally, you've got to show that what you're doing, your intervention, is both necessary and proportionate. And this is where the work of folks like Chris and Ev are really important, because we need more social science to tell us what's really necessary to combat this, what's proportionate. And I think about the actions of many governments in recent months to ban Russian state media from broadcast airwaves and, in the European Union from the internet. Is that necessary? I don't know. How do you tell? How do you tell that it's necessary to ban the whole network as opposed to having someone in a control room somewhere blocking certain segments that are patently false and meant to deceive? So there's a lot that needs to develop there if we're going to have effective laws that are directed frontally at the problem. So let's talk about more indirect approaches instead. And I think this is where the three previous panelists have all spoken, right? So certainly it's clear that we need a vibrant and healthy civil society to counter disinformation. That's the way we're going to combat this problem. And we've seen that in places that are particularly successful, such as Finland, which has been subject to Russian propaganda for the better part of a century, really. It's an existential threat to Finland. And they've invested in developing robust civil society, education on media literacy, etc. Okay, so in thinking about other kinds of regulatory approaches, there's a scholar named Camille Francois who has this really useful framework that she has developed of thinking about actors, behaviors, and content related to disinformation and other kinds of bad content online and offline. And for the reasons I just told you, regulating the content itself is really hard and very fraught for free expression issues. So let's think about actors and behaviors. The actions of certain kinds of actors are much easier to regulate from a legal point of view than going to the end of that pipe and dealing with the content. And this is to build on what Chris said about systems and what we see happening in Europe with regard to platform regulation, with regard not just to disinformation, but other content-related harms, such as non-consensual pornography, for example. So the actors, for complex reasons we can get into in the Q&A, it's much easier to regulate the actions of governments than individuals in this space. There's a stream of opinion that says that governments don't really have a right to free expression, people do. So if a foreign government is messing around and spreading falsehoods or lies or propaganda, it's much easier to make the case for that kind of direct legal regulation of that conduct, similar to what happened with the bans of Russian state media. But let's focus on the B in the ABC framework, which is behavior. So there are some entities whose behavior it forms sort of a central choke point when we think about the information ecosystem, and that's platforms, right? Platforms obviously behave in certain kinds of ways. They're designed in certain kinds of ways, and regulations can be designed that try to improve their behavior in certain kinds of ways. And that's certainly what the Europeans seem to be doing with their Digital Services Act, and what a group here in Canada called the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, which I was very privileged to serve upon, has been recommending as well. That the best way that we can sort of create a healthier online sphere is to incentivize different kinds of platforms and intermediaries to clean up. And so it's kind of like an environmental pollution thing. We're not looking to eliminate 100% of pollution, but there are probably some design tweaks or systems that we can build that are going to identify harms and look for, 90%, a 90% solution that will significantly improve the issue. Now, of course, the problem of disinformation is tied to other kinds of social phenomena. And I think Kevin spoke about this quite powerfully, right? What are the things that lead people to be disenchanted and disenfranchised? How do we promote social cohesion? What's the link between sort of disinformation and populism? And we're living in populist times, right? Where many institutions are seen as underperforming or not delivering the goods for many people. So there's a larger problem of democracy. There's also a question of the production of high quality information, right? So what do we do about fixing our media ecosystem, which is in pretty bad shape? And how do we do that in a way that's consistent with our values, the law of free expression, and the idea of a pluralistic, democratic public sphere? So it's really a multifaceted approach to a multifaceted solution, but going after it directly is not likely to work for a lot of reasons. I'll leave it there. Hi, Errol, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vivek. You've got a lot of issues there, which we could spend hours, if not days, to talk about. So thank you very much. So this is a time where I'm going to be asking the panelists to either ask questions which the audience has asked, and if there's time, myself too. So very quickly, I think there's one question that came in from the audience, which Chris, maybe you can answer. In his question, he said that your data appeared from mostly regular citizens in terms of disinformation. Have you come across data indicating that state actors were intentionally spreading misinformation to undermine the democratic country? What's your question? What's your answer to that?
Yeah, I clicked I would answer live when I was just going to type in, but I will answer live. Our approach to doing this research is not very good at identifying actors behind when they are using particularly inauthentic accounts. So other researchers have done so. And so there's certainly findings about how Russia and other governments not only promote false claims, but more broadly promote narratives to undermine trust and confidence in state agencies and policymakers in countries. And that work continues to be done. There are also, more government-based research that looks at the involvement of state actors on pandemic and election interference, and that includes the rapid response mechanism of the G7 and its activities in Canada and elsewhere. But just to say, some of the challenges we have in understanding actors behind comes to data limitations to researchers. And so having access to that kind of data and finding new ways to work with platforms or others who have that data is important to identify these sorts of patterns.
Thank you, Chris. Actually, there has been a report by the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy, which actually follows up from the question from the audience and answers it in terms of the disinformation on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Apparently, according to their study, they analyzed 6.2 million tweets and retweets related to disinformation, and much of it they found went back to Russia and, interestingly, to the United States. So, in fact, there are potentially two vectors of disinformation strategies coming through from there. So that's one of the main challenges I think Canada has, that we don't only have to be concerned about disinformation from within our borders, but now from the different vectors from others. And I think China was also mentioned as part of their study there. Kevin may actually have some other information on that too. Kevin?
I'll be quick in case even Vivek want to jump in on the question of state-sourced misinformation about health pandemic issues. I'll put some research in the chat that my organization has done on this. We've done a lot of work on the effect of COVID-19 on the information space, and then also kleptocracy and corruption issues. But the information space was especially revealing. I won't go through all the details of what was there from Russia, China, Iran, but essentially the common thread is that a number of governments that are authoritarian leaning are using these sort of tactics of spreading misinformation about COVID-19, either what's happening in their country or responses, simply to show that they cannot fail. And democracies are like ours, our issues are kind of out in the open. It's hard to hide weaknesses on our sleeves. And in authoritarian governments, the societies control the governments control the internet space so much, they simply cannot fail. It sounds like I'm not coming through in the chat, so I'll answer some of this in the chat because it looks like my internet isn't great here, but yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. There's a couple of other questions that come through from the audience, which I think is very interesting. One question from Dr. Patrick Neal asks the question on the issue of attribution. Is it time to examine the role of how much attribution or what types of attribution can guide whatever reaction we may have? That's a very complex question, but I wonder if anyone is willing to answer that.
I can take a crack at that. So I think that attribution in the sort of disinformation and information operations space is a bit less important than in sort of the classic cybersecurity space, right? So attribution is the question of who did it? How can we tell who you are, right? And when it comes to cybersecurity, right, someone hacks the Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, for example. How can we tell who it was if we want to respond proportionately? That's hard. When it comes to disinformation and the kinds of responses that we can take to protect the information space, I think this is sort of where platforms, and we'll hear from them in a moment, right? Platforms are looking, they may look at the content itself, is this thing true or not, and label it. But often they're looking for patterns of activity that suggest that somebody isn't who they say they are, that these accounts are fake, et cetera, right? So I think some of those kinds of questions, like looking again, to go back to that ABC framework, that pattern of behavior can be very indicative of who it is, regardless of the content. And again, if you can avoid trying to regulate the content directly, you're generally on firmer constitutional and human rights grounds in acting against that, the whatever harm that actor is producing, rather than sort of a content-based approach. So I hope that's responsive to the question.
Well, that's a great attempt, Vivek. I know it's a very difficult question. I know many of the public security people are facing that issue. We have another one from another audience
Errol,
member.
I just want
Yes.
to pop in on the attribution question, because I think so. That's a different relationship is to the issue of accountability. And I think that's something that we still need to think about more. I mean, there are different levels of accountability, but let's just talk about accountability for the sources of, either disinformation or the kind of abuse that I'm talking about. I mean, one of the challenges that people on the receiving end of this material face, or who are trying to deal with it, is if there are steps taken to remove accounts, to kick them off platforms, or even to block them, the ability to create new accounts and to get right back to it. And so, are there ways to kind of address that issue? But even more, there's a problem that we would hope that, introduce a real name policy or something else, and then people will behave well. It's, that just, the evidence doesn't show that to be the case. And in fact, that there's a lot of permission given to people and encouragement online for spreading problematic material, and some of the measures that would be taken to kind of achieve accountability for real identities are probably more harmful than we want to pursue. So I think this is one of these real tricky debates in this area, which is how can we improve accountability, or perhaps think about differently and lessen the permissions of repeat offenders or repeat problematic content creators.
Great. One last question before I ask a final question before we turn to the second panel. Valerie asks, for all panelists, what role do you see government playing in transparency communications to the public and the reduction of bureaucratic processes in countering misinformation? Anyone? Eve, maybe, do you want to take a stab at that?
I may. Actually, if someone has a well-crafted, well-thought answer, I may let someone else go ahead.
Actually, whilst the rest of you are thinking of an answer to that, because I think it's a very important question, I want to link that into my question, which is actually based again from the poll by Abacus in terms of some of the disinformation that's coming through in their study of what Canadians believe. Basically, their fundamental conclusion from their polling is that essentially the vast majority seem to believe that much of the information we receive from news organizations is false. They said that was 44% of the adult population. 71% also believed that official government accounts of events can't be trusted. So much for the transparency issue we just been asked about. And so they basically, what the pollsters are saying is that this is really worrying, because if the main sources of information that's coming to the public are from the news media and from government, and either of them do not have much trust by a very substantial number of Canadians, we're in trouble. So how do you actually deal with this whole issue of the threat of mistrust, which is hugely tied into the type of disinformation and the rise of conspiracy theories? So it's a big question, and I would like perhaps any of you or all of you perhaps to give a stab of the solution to that, if there is any solution.
If I could maybe answer both your question and the one of the Q&A about the role of government. I'm going to turn off my video in case my internet improves. But the idea of trust in government is really essential. Some of the interactions I've had with a number of different countries around the world and civil society organizations working on this problem set, I found that the places where there's higher degree of trust among the citizens of the government are places where the government can be more direct in countering disinformation, whether that's foreign source disinformation or something else in the information space. Places where there's less trust, government is actually quite counterproductive. And so there's some governments, including the United States government, that specifically, won't counter direct attacks on, specific truths or whatever that's happening that seem quite obvious about what the United States is doing, domestically or abroad or some other aspect of society, because they feel like they simply just won't be credible. Sometimes they're more aggressive against foreign source disinformation than others. So right now there's a couple countries in the Nordic regions, Sweden, and I think Chris mentioned Finland earlier, or it could have been Vivek. Anyways, that are taking more aggressive approach. Sweden actually just launched a psychological defense agency, which is a pretty aggressive approach to defending its information space, but it still draws certain lines on kind of around its borders. It's more aggressive against foreign source disinformation than it is against sort of things that are happening domestically that are more contained within Sweden. But that's a really important point, I think, is trust in government. And it kind of gets this idea of what can government do, what shouldn't government do. There's probably not clear lines. A lot of times it may depend on exactly the relationship between government and society and that level of trust.
Does anyone else have any issues of how one deals with the fact that now substantial numbers of Canadians, apparent, if this poll is correct, do not trust either the vast majority of the news sources they're getting from or the governments?
Yeah, I'll just say a quick thing on trust of the press or of journalists. I mean, this is another one of these global issues, and in a lot of countries, and we've seen it in the most recent report from the Reuters Institute, based out of Oxford, about decline in trust in Canadian media and many other countries. Interestingly, not decline, if I remember correctly, in trust in media in Francophone Canada compared to Anglophone. And we might look into why that might be the case. But it's a big issue with a lot of factors. I'm helping run a study that's working in part with the Committee to Protect Journalists, looking at what I'm calling credibility attacks on journalists globally. And this is intentional, will sometimes be intentional, will sometimes be organic, often a combination of efforts to discredit journalists or journalism organizations because of the reporting they do. So I think one of the issues at stake around trust is we have kind of a negative feedback loop where the more there are attacks on these institutions, the less they're able to address both the attacks on other issues of fact that need to be buttressed, but also on their own reputations or what it is that they are doing or their own motivations. And so that's a real challenge, getting out of that cycle. Figuring out, often a big part of addressing these issues is both performing in ways that will lead to better evaluation and trust of you, and then finding ambassadors or spokespeople or representatives to communities that may be able to provide a better understanding of what it is you're doing and maybe build up trust that way.
Thank you very much, Chris. We just have a couple of minutes left before we go to the second panel. If anyone else does not have a question, let me ask the final question for myself. I think Vivek mentioned it, that what's law got to do with all of this? And we now have possible solutions which are mixed law and mixed social science, mixed a lot of other things from both the EU in terms of the Digital Services Act and also from the UK with their version of trying to have law apply to some but not to others. As we all know, that has pleased nobody and pleased everyone at the same time. So is there actually a solution to this really difficult challenge? Anyone willing to take one final stab at that question before we move to the second panel?
One syllable answer, no. There's no solution. But I think that's actually not the way that we should frame the issue, right? I think it was Chris that mentioned spectra several times, right? That I think a way to think about this, it is like pollution, or like trace contaminants, There's going to be some level of this stuff in any society, right? That's part of the price of having a free society that believes in allowing pluralistic opinion to flourish, right? And there's a risk in coming down too hard against this because, yesterday's disinformation is today's Copernican theory or something like that, perhaps. So I think what we need to do, right, it is that kind of ecosystem-based approach. There's a great question in the chat. Anonymous person says, what if disinformation is a symptom, right, rather than a problem itself? To which I say that, it's kind of like a virus. The question is, does that virus harm a particular body politic or not? And that depends on many different kinds of factors, right? I think everyone has made that point powerfully. So as with the vaccines in the current pandemic, right, there's things we can do. It's that Swiss cheese model of prevention that it's going to take lots of different layers of masks or pieces of cheese or whatever your analogy is to combat this problem and bring it down to a more acceptable level before it really corrodes the foundations of our democratic institutions and our democratic society.
Well, valiant answer, Vivek, to that almost impossible question, but I'm sure that it's going to take many more events and future discussions that will follow up on that. Thank you all so much from this first panel. I'll ask all of you to put your cameras off as we go to the second panel with Michelle and Rachel from Facebook and Twitter. So with that in mind, I am going to introduce Michelle Austin, who is the head of policy at Twitter Canada. In that role, she acts as the envoy of Twitter with governments and civil society. Michelle has worked at the executive level in the public, non-profit, and private sectors for the last 25 years and holds undergraduate and master's degrees from Waterloo and Dalhousie University. I'll introduce Rachel after you present, Michelle. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Wow. The scope of this conversation is incredible, and just, we at the platforms get to deal with all of it, whereas we have specialists here who get to deal with some of it. Errol, you're going to probably have to flag me down. I have a lot to say. So let's start with a reminder that the platforms are all very different. So I know we talk of big tech as one big barbarian, but we are very different. So just a reminder from a Twitter perspective, Twitter is fast. People don't come to Twitter to see what happened yesterday. They come to see events in real time. Twitter is open. I was interested to hear that data with regard to Russia and Ukraine was based on tweets. That's because we allow we have an API and application program interface, and we allow everybody, including GAP's rapid misinformation crew, to have access to our data, and it's public. In that way, you don't have to ask the majority of Twitter users if you can be their friend or if you can follow them. You can just go ahead and follow them. And then just a reminder that you could turn off the algorithm on Twitter. So I don't know, hopefully you could see this little star on the top right here. When you press that, we call it the swish button, you can pick as a user between whether or not you will see your timelines in reverse chronological order, or whether you will ask us through the algorithm to surface what we consider to be the best tweets. So, okay, let's go. Taking my cue from Kevin, who spoke first, I want to talk first about the misinformation landscape, and then I want to recap some of the foundational work Twitter has been doing to support the health and integrity of the public conversation. Misinformation does indeed exist on a spectrum. Misinformation is also not new. So for those who are perhaps of the Christian faith, I always say that the serpent, possibly the one of the four first and foremost influencers, did in the Garden of Eden convince Eve that the apple was good. So misinformation is not new. On one end, there are claims that are unequivocally false. They are inaccurate, fabricated, and outright lies. Think of outrageous conspiracy theories like the earth is flat, or a new great one that birds aren't real, and then they are in fact all secret government surveillance drones. On the other end of the spectrum are the claims that are a bit murkier. They may be only partially false or statements taken out of context. And then, of course, add to what Chris talked about, which is lawful but awful, which I always say in my house is what my mother-in-law says to me in real life, not on a platform, which I often wonder why she says. The fact of the matter is misinformation isn't always intentional, mother-in-law, or malicious. Untrue statements might be shared or amplified by someone that doesn't know that what they're sharing is in fact false. One of our jobs at Twitter is to assess whether misleading tweets have the potential to cause harm, and if they do, what actions Twitter should take as a consequence. So let's focus in on harm. Twitter's official misinformation policies don't apply to all false and misleading information shared on the service. There's a difference between policy violating misinformation and the stuff that's just plain untrue, but unlikely to cause harm. As a result of this focus on harmful misinformation, Twitter's current policies address content in 3 areas: synthetic and manipulated media, civic integrity, and COVID-19 misinformation. The COVID-19 policy applies to content that is demonstrably false or misleading and may lead to significant risk of harm, such as increased exposure to the virus or adverse effects on public health systems. Civic integrity covers more civic processes like elections or the census or voting. And our synthetic and manipulated media policy covers media that has been fabricated, doctored, or manipulated in some way, such as deep fakes, or media that is shared out of context. Twitter first introduced our misinformation policy focused on synthetic and manipulated media in early 2020, which was our first crack at a misinformation policy, following a public consultation and research period. So we acted like many of you would think governments do. We had a public consultation, and we also did some research. Launching this policy required us to build an entirely new functionality to allow us, for the very first time, to enforce on a rule violating content outside of what is called leave up or take down binary, right? People often think there's only 2 solutions to misinformation. You leave it up or you take it down. We use labels. Labels give us a third way to intervene and mitigate harm without always taking the step of removing the content entirely. Let's talk for a second about why that third way is so important. Our rules exist to reduce harm while maintaining a delicate balance with people's rights to free expression, which Vivek talked about. Open public dialogue is especially important when it comes to matters of public concern, like elections or new medical developments in the context of a global pandemic. In the 15th century, the idea that the sun, not the earth, is at the center of the solar system was widely decried as heresy, but that changed through public debate and science. We need to preserve that space for the debate to happen over and over again, and moving too quickly to remove could inhibit those conversations when they're needed most. But that doesn't mean taking a totally hands-off approach either, especially where potentially misleading claims could lead to harm. We want to give people the information they need to make informed choices to keep themselves and those around them safe, right? Choice, personal responsibility, which brings us to our overall policy for approach for misinformation. Through the Twitter rules, we take the enforcement action required to address the harm caused by a misleading statement. We do this using a wide range of tools, not just the binary choice of leave up or take down. For severe and immediate harms, we remove tweets so they aren't seen at all. For less severe harms, we use labels to provide access to authoritative context while also restricting the spread of those claims. We do this by adding prompts or warnings, behavioral theory, when people attempt to share content that has been labeled, and by ensuring our algorithms do not further amplify that content through recommendations. It is that middle ground, we hope, that will protect debate while also mitigating harm. One of our biggest challenges and opportunities for misinformation and content moderation generally is delivering this work on a global scale. Today, we use a combination of technology and human review to proactively identify misinformation, with more than 50% of violative content surfaced by our automated systems, and the majority of remaining content we enforce on is surfaced through regular monitoring by our internal teams, work with our trusted partners, and reports by people like you. We do this so we can take a global approach to our efforts to limit the spread of potentially harmful and misleading content on our service. We proactively evaluate content for violations in a number of languages, including Arabic, English, French, Hindi, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Spanish, and Turkish. And we're working to expand even more. In August, we began testing a new information reporting feature in the US, Australia, and South Korea. We selected these countries because we want to learn from a geographically diverse set of regions, including those where English is not the primary language, before we scale these features globally. Since rolling out this misinformation reporting experiment, we found that the reports are helpful, but noisy for identifying specific violations of our rules. On average, with this misinformation reporting flow experiment, only about 10% of the misinformation reports we reviewed through the flow were actionable, compared to 20 to 30% for our other policy areas that you can report on in the platform or on our web page. A key driver of this was off-topic reports that didn't contain any misinformation at all. For example, we saw a lot of reports of voting misinformation that related to contests and votes about people's favorite musical artists. I will tell you, if you are a fan of K-pop, one of the groups that flooded this misinformation reporting flow were K-pop fans who reported that if anybody tweeted that a band other than their favorite band like BTS was the best band in the world, for instance, if somebody said the Beatles is the greatest band that's ever lived, we would be inundated with misinformation reports that that was in fact wrong. To make review of individual reports efficient, we need to build technology to filter out and prioritize reports. That's why we're continuing to experiment instead of rolling out reporting to everyone. So there is no misinformation reporting flow in Canada. We need more research and training data, especially outside of English, as Eve pointed out, to help us optimize how we will use these reports. We're already seeing clear benefits from reporting for identifying patterns and trends in misinformation, and trends are actually a lot bigger in areas like India or Brazil than they are in Canada, especially when it comes to non-text-based misinformation, such as media and URLs linking to off-platform misinformation. So we're going to continue to experiment with this reporting flow. We don't have the answer yet. With regard to civil society, when we talk to people who use Twitter, we hear again and again that they know there's misleading information out there, and they would appreciate information that helped them identify it, gave them more context, and allowed them to make up their own mind about it. The challenge is, how would you add that context in a way that feels fair and that people trust and find informative? We know, for example, not everyone trusts or wants a technology company, as Eve talked about, or any singular institution like government to make those decisions. So that challenge is what inspired us to launch the pilot of a program called Birdwatch a year ago. Everything's birds here. The basic way it works is that people sign up to be contributors. They can write a proposed note or annotation to a tweet, and other contributors can rate that note for its helpfulness. So for instance, if somebody tweeted the sky is blue, a climate scientist could say, yes, I confirm that the sky is blue, and here's why I know that. The idea is that if enough people from different points of view find the note helpful, they would then show it on the tweet as an annotation. Today, the pilot has about 10,000 contributors in it, and with all the work throughout the past year, we're seeing results that include that the majority of people found these notes to be either somewhat or extremely helpful. People were 20 to 40% less likely to agree with misleading information in a tweet after reading the note about it. Most notes have been rated highly on accuracy by professional reviewers. So this is another ecosystem, right? Who reviews what the reviewers review. And it has been rare so far to find a note that reviewers agree to be inaccurate. So these are really encouraging signs that the civil society approach can help people stay better informed. But one of the most significant things that we found out with Birdwatch was with regard to anonymity. People now in Birdwatch contribute under aliases. Originally, people contributed under their Twitter usernames, but we heard from both current and prospective contributors that they worried they might be harassed for writing a note on a prominent tweet. So we switched everyone to auto-generated aliases. This has other potential benefits too. While anonymity and pseudonymity can get a bad rap on the internet, research, for example, from Chris Bale, from the professor of sociology and director of the Polarization Lab at Duke University, shows it has the potential to help with polarization. people can be more willing to acknowledge their agreement with someone on the other side of their identity or their issue, on the other side of an issue if their identity isn't publicly attached to it. Our efforts in the space do not happen in a silo, and our approach continues to evolve with the speed of the conversation happening in real time on our service. There's still so much more work to do, which we talked about here, and we will continue to be transparent about our efforts and the teams driving our work. We have a transparency report, and you can also follow all of this information on, wait for it, Twitter. We also have a new hub for all things related to our approach and efforts to address misinformation at help.twitter.com/misinformation. And so with that, I will hand the mic over to Rachel.
Thanks.
Thank you very.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Earl.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Michelle. I love this idea of birdwatch. So there are the Canadian elves. So it'd be interesting to see how that develops over time. So I'd like to introduce Rachel for Facebook Canada. Rachel Curran is the public policy manager for Facebook Canada. She's a lawyer by training and has nearly 15 years of experience in public affairs, including extensive experience in providing strategic and policy advice to a former Canadian Prime Minister. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Errol. So let me pick up on some of what Michelle said. Look, Facebook's an open platform for all ideas, a place where we want to encourage self-expression, connection, and sharing. However, at the same time, when people come to Facebook, we always want them to feel welcome and safe and to have a good experience on the platform. We have, as a matter of policy and principle, zero tolerance for things like hate speech and disinformation or misinformation. But unfortunately, zero tolerance doesn't always mean zero incidences. We do, though, invest billions of dollars each year in people and in technology to keep our platform safe. And we've also tripled to more than 40,000 the people working on safety and security at Facebook. We continue to refine our policies based on direct feedback from experts and specific impacted communities to address new risks as they emerge. And we're also a pioneer in artificial intelligence technology to remove problematic content at scale. So today, nearly 90% of content we remove for violating our policies is detected by our systems before anyone reports it to us. So let me start with those policies called our community standards. A lot of people don't know they exist. They cover many dozens of pages, and I would encourage listeners to read through them. We're in the process of commissioning research to see how they compare to standards enshrined in law internationally. But suffice it to say, they cover material well beyond what would be considered illegal in Canadian law. And of course, we're able to implement more stringent speech and expression standards because as a private company, Facebook is not subject to the Charter of Canadian Rights and Freedoms. And our community standards also cover at least some, but not all of the lawful but awful content that Chris referenced earlier. So you'll find, if you take a look at them, that the community standards cover a host of different issues: bullying and harassment, violent and graphic content, false news, misinformation, things like that. And our standards are also global, which I think is important to note. So let me talk a little bit about misinformation specifically. We've got a pretty comprehensive strategy to try and stop misinformation on Facebook, and it has three parts. So firstly, we remove accounts and content that violate our community standards, and that's meant to kind of reinforce the safety and security of the platform. Secondly, we reduce the distribution of content that doesn't directly violate our community standards, but nonetheless is of low quality, so our users don't enjoy seeing it. And when we reduce the distribution, that means less people see it. So this includes things like false news, and we partner with over 80 fact-checking partners around the world who cover this material in over 50 languages. In Canada, it's Radio Canada and Agence France Presse, who we work with as fact checkers. And when these organizations fact check something as false, we dramatically reduce its distribution. And by the way, this also applies to political or civic content now also, because we heard from users that they wanted to see less of that in their feeds. So we now downrank that content too. And then our third kind of prong of the misinformation strategy is that we inform people by giving them more context so they can decide for themselves what they want to read, to trust, and to share. So when a post is rated false by fact checkers, we apply strong warning labels on top of the content with research from fact checkers accompanying that overlay. And we also partner with local organizations around the world to promote news literacy and digital literacy. But internally, tackling misinformation is not an easy task. It requires addressing several challenges, including fake accounts, deceptive behavior, and misleading and harmful content. So let me start with fake accounts. We take a hard line against this activity, and we block millions of fake accounts each day, most of them at the time of creation. In a recent quarter, for instance, we disabled more than 1.3 billion, that's billion with a B, fake accounts. We also investigate and take down covert foreign and domestic influence operations that rely on these fake accounts. Over the past 3 years, for instance, we've removed over 100 networks of what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior from our platform. And we keep the public informed about our efforts through our monthly reports on coordinated inauthentic behavior, and you can find those online. We also crack down on deceptive behavior. So we found that one of the best ways to fight deceptive behavior is by disrupting economic incentives behind it. We've built teams and systems to detect and enforce against inauthentic behavior tactics behind a lot of clickbait. We also use artificial intelligence to help us detect fraud and enforce our policies against